Okay. Now, so one of the reasons I do these videos is because I hope that they serve a kind of referent to encourage my patients. That is to say that, as we know, I do a kind of free associating. Maybe that's all I know how to do. But something more important here, and it is at the crux of what I'm trying to formulate, and this is the way I know how to do it. At least I know that it's my way. Is that speaking whatever comes to mind is a way of establishing one's identity. And as we know, identity has become the raison d'etre of our time, it seems. And in turn, there's been a backlash against that. Against the identity politics, like the Peterson crowd. Of course, the irony is they only do that through their own identity sourcing, actually. And that will be another topic, actually, is how knowledge is sourced today. You know, if you want to recall something, you bring it up on your unconscious of the iPhone, rather than recalling it with your own mind, I mean, to a large extent. As you know, people are all lost today, literally. They can't find their way back home without Google Maps. But I want to suggest, perhaps this is just speculative, but at best, that one of the reasons, besides technology, that we source information is because our childhood was outsourced. That the job of the parent is a job of outsourcing today. Now, the other topic at hand here, and for which I'm trying to establish a paper, is life coaching. It's not only the butt of jokes of therapists, and in fact, it may be better than therapy today. And I'm going to go over why I think that is the case. It has to do with our era of the spectrum. It has to do with what looks like as if, I mean, it's not autism, but it looks as if we're becoming more autistic-esque. You know, we are in our own shells, we are isolated from everything, and we need to find our own special way into the social bond. And in fact, it's social discourse, the social bond, that we find our troubles, if you will. That phenomenon of being lonely as hell and being overly saturated with connection at the same time. Now, one of the ways I'm going to make the case for life coaching being essentially more compatible with our times than psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, and now take that with a grain of salt, because what I'm advocating here is essentially psychoanalysis, is essentially Lacanian psychoanalysis, but with a more active role. Here I'm going to bring in a term of Jacques-Alain Miller's. The analyst must be, or at least must be able to perform a multifunctional object. Now I'm talking myself, to be incredibly flexible and to be fluent in psychosis and neurosis, to address our time that it seems like the symptoms present themselves less as neuroses and less as psychoses and more as this borderline. And one, to address that borderline, must be fluent in neurosis and psychosis. And now here I would say this spectrum we can call, borderline spectrum, we can call autistic spectrum, we can call ADHD spectrum. and we're trying to figure out where our identity is in that place. And now what I'm suggesting is that one of the ways that someone sutures themselves into the social bond, one of the ways one finds their own solution, one of the ways one is okay, is by finding identity. That identity is what we source in order to create our own identity, initially as part of a group of identities. So as you know, the splintering of groups, whether you're seeing it now in the autism literature, this neurodiversity, that we splinter off not only into essentially pathological groups like Asperger's groups, like I'm ADD group, like I'm bipolar group, but then the identity politics, the I am a woman, I am trans, I am a minority of some case. And in fact, we are indeed going to the place where we all want to be identified as a specific minority. A minority that is on a spectrum that doesn't know where it wants to be in the social bond, and yet nonetheless wants to defer itself out to its own particularity. Now, how I'm going to do this is by giving a little introduction to this Lacanian psychoanalytic concept of ordinary psychosis, or as a colleague, Scott, is trying to differentiate it, universal madness, which would involve, I believe, our particular parsing out of our own delusions. And Lacan makes a good point when he says that anytime you're making sense, it's a delusion, that you're stuck in your own delusion, which is often a shared delusion within society, and that's, I suppose, one of the points. So now, before I go into what ordinary psychosis is, which I'm not necessarily, I don't know how important that is to anyone else but psychoanalysts in order to orient your work, I will say a little bit how one gets out of ordinary psychosis, out of this borderline state. Essentially, the best way to put it is that you find your identity. It's kind of a fetishized identity, and this is the point. With the psychosis, with any psychosis, you don't have an anchoring point, what in Lacanian psychoanalysis is called the nom du père, the name of the father, something that you name. It's actually a predicate, it's not a literal naming, but some sort of amalgamation of concepts that allows you to organize your world, to libidinally organize yourself. And this comes from Lacan's version of the Oedipus complex, the paternal metaphor. Now, in neurosis, you have the paternal metaphor. In psychosis, you don't have the paternal metaphor. Right, it's kind of like a gaping hole. Now, the idea, according to Jacques-Alain Miller, is that you have it's funny, mère. Like I made a slip there, mother in French. Okay, you have a sort of stand-in for the name of the father in ordinary psychosis. That's not actually, registering completely to make one neurotic, but that is as he calls it, a compensatory make-believe. And that sounds right, and it's related essentially to Lacan's notion of the synthome in the late Lacan, the artificial man, something that is synthetically created by the individual in order to keep them sutured, in order to keep them stabilized. Now, this is the difference between psychotic and ordinary psychosis. In psychosis, you have something that is essentially extraordinarily there. Obviously, schizophrenia being the extreme example. Now, what you have with ordinary psychosis, and what I would argue what you have in the spectrum, that place between neurosis and psychosis, is, a notion where someone is kept together by their identity, that which differentiates them, that which keeps their particularity running within the social bond, then becomes triggered. And don't we know this very well, this word of being triggered, why kids want to advocate for the safe space. Of course, the safe space is probably just a place to play out your psychosis, but that's another story. So if one gets triggered, and it seems pretty clear to me that one, and this goes with the theory of ordinary psychosis, but they don't make this blatant, one is triggered if their identity is questioned. If their specific role that they have carved out that allows them to enter the social bond and be outside of it is disrupted, one is triggered. And again, those identities, for example, I was reading this article asking, is everyone on the spectrum? The answer, autism spectrum, the answer is no, but it gives this example at the end of this Asperger's group, where they're very much, and there's many groups like this, right, where they're kind of clinging to this identity, which is a pathological identity, but one that allows them to enter into a social bond of identity. Now, if you remove that, you get triggered and you enter into this borderline state proper. And it's a funny coincidence that if you have neurosis on one side and psychosis on one side, it actually says NP, which is the shorthand for nom du père, name of the father. So where was I? If you're triggered, this would trigger the psychosis. And this is one reason why it seems to me that in our age, people don't need the frequent dream interpretation of the neurotic in psychoanalysis, that they come more for check-ins. And this seems to be the case when I talk to other clinicians, that people less and less present themselves with neurotic structures. I mean, psychotics already were, either hospitalized or didn't come to analysis as much as neurosis, but that people are more presenting themselves as borderline, and they come essentially for check-ins. Indeed, the work is oriented more like a conversation, which, eventually I want to bring back full circle to why this life coaching is not just a joke. And I'll reveal it right now, why it's not just a joke, and it's because in life coaching it helps you find your identity. That which sutures you to the social bond, and that which prevents the triggering of extraordinary psychosis. Indeed, what keeps one going? What we find today is that someone creates a very strong identity around, say, their job. And then I've also given the example of identity politics suturing, where someone is attached through that. It would then be the life coach's job to help establish that identity. But now here's where the psychoanalytic part you have to emphasize the psychoanalytic part. It has to come about through their own particular subjectivity. And you're not going to give it to them. You're not going to tell them, oh, you would be suited to this job, your skill set matches this. That's bullshit. That is regular life coaching, and it's totally bullshit. But you would take in their information, and you would be more receptive than the analyst, the neutral analyst sitting on his chair, disinterestedly listening would be. You would allow them to guide themselves into what their identity is. Now, the hope would be that it's not an identity that's very superficial, like the minority identifications, like the disability identifications. Precisely that it's their identification, but nonetheless, it's that identification which allows them to enter into the social bond and to stabilize. And that is actually much more, I would argue, your goal, rather than the free association interpretive work. Or at very least, and I think I'll end this here because it's a nice place to end, it's that getting to that point is what gets them to become a neurotic, which allows the real work of interpretation, if you want it, that just makes life more enjoyable and more interesting to happen. Thank you very much.